Hey everyone, this is our second lecture for week 4. We'll cover evaluation writing. I'm a little conscious that the first lecture for this week went a little bit long, so I'm going to try to go fast through this one and then definitely next one, which is even a little bit shorter. But for today, we'll cover evaluation writing. And I wanted to start with an interesting piece of information, which is the definition of evaluation. So this comes from the American Heritage Dictionary, which defines evaluate as to determine the importance, effectiveness, or worth of, assess, for example, evaluate teacher performance. But the interesting part that I really wanted to stress was this background of the word evaluation, which you can read all through all this if you want. But basically, it comes from Old French through Latin. And the central part of it is this idea of value or values, which is something that's come up often in our business writing course. And so it turns out the real central part of this word is the valuate part. And so it falls all into that idea of ethos, of knowing what your organization's values are, and also I guess pathos in some ways, right? How do you sort of react emotionally to something and value it in that way? And so to get into it more on the rhetorical level, what are evaluations to us? Well, they really begin as everyday casual arguments. You're evaluating things kind of all day, every day. The outfits you pick out, you evaluate for, hey, is this good to wear to class? Is this good to wear to a lecture, for example? You evaluate coffee shops, for example. Is this a good place to study? Is this place overcrowded? Is there too much noise, and so on. You evaluate playlists, like, hey, does this have really good music for the gym, really good music for the commute, ideas like that. And so as with many topics in this course, what we want to do with evaluations is go from the unconscious level to the conscious level. And so by doing that, we uncover our own values, our own motives, our own preferences. Um, Evaluations can be cultural too. So ones that I sort of searched up really quickly online are ones like the 10 best smartphones, right? Which implies that everybody sort of has the same expectations of a smartphone. Um, like Western ideas of I need it to email, I need it to be connected throughout the world, and things like that. So they get down to the cultural level, or People Magazine's world's handsomest man, although I think they use a different word than handsome. But if you go back and look at it, it always seems to be a famous person, right? So how did they sort of culturally come to that fame gets equated with this idea of being handsome? So evaluations do go onto the cultural level, but in business and in academia, they become formalized. You can think about grades. How does somebody determine an A, a B, or a C? You can think about labor-based grading, perhaps, as breaking down the norms that are embedded in that ABC structure. And then think of performance evaluations in business. Likely, if you've already had your first job, whether it was in your major or just something you did in the summers, you were probably evaluated on some level for your performance at that job. And those only get sort of more complex as you go forward in your career. But by looking at those, we can uncover rather the values, motives, and preferences of our organizations, which is a really interesting way of, again, kind of switching this idea of unconsciousness to consciousness. Sort of, what do I just assume my organization is looking for versus what's really embedded in the evaluations of its employees, and so on. And so just a last quick note on what evaluations are. They can come in two forms, which are the quantitative or the qualitative. So quantitative, you're thinking about things like grades and performance evaluations. You can be graded on a scale from 1 to 10. You can be graded on a scale from F to A. And then qualitative, you can think about evaluations that ask, for example, additional comments here or something like that, and you get to sort of type out a longer response rather than just clicking a number. So I'll start with what makes bad criteria. And I have here an example I encountered once when in my own education. And it was called the Alexander case study. Other people in business or finance might have encountered this themselves. But basically, you have this character, Alexander, who is really effective at his job, but is really disliked by his employees and by his coworkers. And so you can be asked to give him a grade based on this scale, that he exceeds expectations, should be promoted this year, that he fully meets expectations and exceeds expectations in some areas, that he meets expectation in most areas, that he's not ready for promotion, 2, that he needs improvement in some areas, meets expectations in some areas, and 1, that he needs improvement in all areas. And these employees are often terminated. And then you're given this last piece of information that if Alex gets below a 4, he might resign. And so I'll break down what makes this bad criteria. First, these are kind of arbitrary, should be promoted this year, on track, but could wait a year, and not ready for promotion at all. These kind of don't make a lot of sense as far as what they're trying to accomplish. And this goes all the way down to 1, where it says individuals receiving this evaluation are often terminated. Well, why not make that 0, right? Why is someone getting any points if they're going to get fired? And so these are a little bit arbitrary as far as what the evaluation can mean and what it's shooting for. And then you'll also notice there's a lot of vague language throughout. So some areas goes back and forth between some and most, some areas here in 4, some areas here in 2, most here in 3. And you can question sort of why does that go back and forth? And is the evaluator given really specific ways to evaluate here? And the answer is no. And so you get a lot of vague language, you get a lot of problematic stuff. And then lastly, you're given this piece of information, right? And this really biases you. And so that's an example of bad criteria. And so from that, we can draw out what makes good criteria. So first and foremost, it makes expectations clear, which traits, which accomplishments specifically are being evaluated, right? So back here, we have some areas and most areas, but we don't know which areas are being prioritized. Oops, I went back one. Which ones are being prioritized or evaluated specifically. And then second, along with those expectations, you should consider here the values, the motives, the preferences of the institution. In that case study, particularly on that scale, you don't get any of that. And so you're kind of lost as to how you're supposed to evaluate this person. And that's, I should say, part of the point of the case study, I think, is to make it difficult and make you kind of question those things. They should be laid out on a logical scale. Many different scales work. As I mentioned, you get graded from F through A. And that one's, kind of arbitrary, but it works. Other scales like 1 through 10 work, 1 through 5 stars works. If you're thinking about a survey, very bad through very good, with bad, neutral, and good in between works. It's just a question of laying it out logically. And so, for example, like I said, if you're going to get terminated in this case study, shouldn't that scale kind of start at 0 instead of giving somebody any points at all? Or you think about why that 1 is even there. And so as you lay out your scale, think about what each level might mean. And I'll give you a case study to work on this on Canvas this week. And you do not want to bias your author. And so, for example, that line, you fear that Alex will resign, biases what criteria which number on the scale you might give him. And then with qualitative feedback, you can think about this as well. In the first slide, I mentioned this idea of additional comments here, right? Do you have any additional comments versus can you list anything this person did wrong, which kind of biases your evaluator into listing only bad things. So all stuff to think about. But like I said, I wanted to keep that one short, and I'll give you a case study to practice, but that's evaluations. And those are some ideas, again, for just bringing those values, those preferences you have from the unconscious level onto the conscious level. And so I'll look forward to seeing what you do with your case study practice, and we'll have one more video for this week. Thanks, everyone.